Somewhere in the hills west of San Antonio early this morning, an emergency manager watched the Guadalupe River do the one thing it is never supposed to do, and sent out a warning about a dangerous wall of water already moving downstream. Not rising slowly, moving, and onto ground that was already flooding. The forecast was calling for another 6 to 8 inches of rain, with some places pushing past 10. So people all across the Texas Hill Country are standing at their windows asking one simple question out loud. Why won't the rain stop? But the real answer is not in the forecast at all. It is buried in the shape of the land itself, in a fault line most Texans have never heard of, and once you understand it, today's flood stops looking like bad luck and starts looking like a machine that was built to do exactly this. If you want the whole picture, subscribe to the Sky Lab, because this story is still moving downstream as we speak, and we follow it all the way to why. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, and whether you have ever seen a quiet creek turn into a river right in front of you. Now, let's get into it. Part 1. The water was already rising. Somewhere in the hills west of San Antonio this morning, an emergency manager watched a river do the one thing that river is not supposed to be able to do, and picked up the phone. The message that went out was short, and it was specific, and it should stop you cold. A dangerous flood wave was moving down the Guadalupe River, not rising, not cresting, moving. A wall of water travelling downstream toward everyone who lived along the banks, and the warning that followed it stayed in effect until well after 10 o'clock that night. I want you to sit with the word wave for a second, because it tells you what kind of story this is. When most of us picture a flood, we picture water that creeps. It comes up over the curb, then over the sidewalk, then across the yard, slow enough that you can watch it happen, and slow enough that you can leave. That is what flooding looks like almost everywhere in this country. It is not what flooding looks like here. In this corner of Texas, the water does not creep, it arrives. And on the morning of July 16th, 2026, it was arriving on ground that was already underwater. That is the detail everything else in this video hangs on, so let me put it plainly before we go anywhere else. This was not the start of the flooding. The flooding had already started. When the National Weather Service wrote up its warnings that morning, the phrase it kept reaching for was not that flooding might happen, or was likely, or was expected. The phrase was that flash flooding was already occurring. Roads were already closed. Rivers were already over their banks. And into that, onto ground that had no capacity left to absorb another drop, the Weather Prediction Center was forecasting another 6 to 8 inches of rain. With isolated totals climbing past 10 inches, spread across the Texas Hill Country and Central Texas through the day. 6 to 8 inches of rain in a single day is a serious event on its own, anywhere. Drop it on dry ground with good drainage, and you get a bad afternoon. Drop it on a landscape that is already saturated, already channeling water into rivers that are already rising, and you get something else entirely. You remove the one thing standing between heavy rain and disaster, which is the ground's ability to soak some of it up and slow the rest of it down. On July 16th, that buffer was gone. It had been used up by the rain that came before. There is a specific reason meteorologists watch for that condition with dread, and it comes down to a concept called antecedent moisture, a clumsy phrase for a simple and deadly idea. The danger of any given rainstorm depends enormously on the state of the ground it lands on, which was set by whatever happened before it arrived. Ground that starts dry has capacity, a reservoir of empty pore space in the soil that can absorb a first flush of rain and buy everyone downstream some time. Ground that starts saturated has no capacity at all. Every drop that falls on it becomes runoff almost immediately, sprinting toward the nearest creek instead of soaking in. So the same 8 inches of rain that might merely be a nuisance on dry ground becomes a flood emergency on wet ground. And the hill country on July 16th was already wet, already at capacity, already spilling over. The rain in the forecast was not going to be absorbed. It was going to be delivered, almost in full, straight into rivers that had no room left to take it. So the question that titles this whole thing is not rhetorical, and it is not lazy. Why won't the rain over Texas stop? People across the hill country were asking it literally, standing at their windows watching water they had already watched all week keep coming. And the honest answer, the one we are going to spend our time together unpacking, is stranger and more unsettling than the flood itself. Because the flood you can see today is the symptom. The reason it is happening here, and the reason it keeps happening here, is a thing you cannot see at all. It is buried in the shape of the land and the physics of the sky, and once you understand it, The flooding stops looking like bad luck and starts looking like something closer to a machine. Let me give you the shape of the day as it actually unfolded, because the raw sequence of it matters. By late morning, Central Time, the warnings were stacking on top of each other faster than anyone could read them. There was a flash flood warning for northeastern Borden County and northern Scurry County out in West Texas, where Doppler radar was showing thunderstorms producing torrential downpours, and a mesonet station near the town of Snyder had measured 1.34 inches of rain in a matter of minutes. There was a warning for northeastern Mitchell County and southeastern Scurry County, where the public was reporting flash flooding along the roads between the small towns of Era and Dunn, and where the storms were described the way you never want to hear storms described during a flood, as slow-moving. Slow-moving is the enemy here. We will come back to why, because it is central to everything, but hold on to it. Then the warnings marched east and south into the heart of the hill country, and the numbers got worse. In northwestern Medina County, emergency management reported that between 3 and 15 inches of rain had already fallen. Read that range again, 3 to 15 inches in a single county on a single morning. That is not a typo and it is not sloppiness. That spread is a fingerprint. It tells you that within a few miles one community got a hard rain and another community got a genuine catastrophe, because the storms had parked over one and spared the other. That kind of extreme knife-edge variability is one of the signatures of the exact setup that produces this region's deadliest floods, and we will earn the full explanation of it later. For now, just notice that a 15-inch reading and a 3-inch reading came out of the same county on the same morning, and let that tell you how localized and how violent this rain was. Across the hill country, more warnings. Kimball County, Mason County, eastern Sutton County, where radar showed thunderstorms dropping heavy rain, and some locations had already taken on up to 4 inches. Coke, Nolan, Runnels, and Taylor counties, where up to 6 inches had fallen before the heaviest rain briefly let up. And notice the geography of that list because it is doing something important. Snyder and the roads between Ira and Dunn are out in West Texas, well northwest of the hill country proper. Medina County is down toward the southern edge, southwest of San Antonio. Kimball, Mason, and Sutton are in the west central hills. Comal, Kendall, and Kerr are in the heart of the hill country itself. These are not neighboring towns getting hit by one storm. They are spread across a huge arc of central and west Texas, hundreds of miles end to end, and every one of them was flooding at the same time. When warnings light up across a spread that wide, all on the same morning, it means the entire regional atmosphere is primed. Not that a single cell wandered over a single town. The whole board was wet, and the whole board was firing. And then the two that carried the most weight, the ones that named the rivers with the longest and darkest histories. West central Kendall County and east central Kerr County, where emergency management reported thunderstorms producing heavy rain directly along the Guadalupe River, and where flash flooding in the plain words of the warning was already occurring. And central Comal County and east central Kendall County, where that dangerous flood wave was moving down the Guadalupe, and where the warning would not expire until 10:15 that night. Look at what the warning for the Guadalupe actually specified, because the wording is chilling in its precision. It was not a general caution that the river might rise. Emergency management had reported a dangerous flood wave moving down the river, with additional rainfall of up to an inch still possible on top of it, and the warning extended until 10:15 at night. That is a warning built around a specific physical thing that someone had actually observed, a wave of water in motion being tracked as it travelled. When a warning stops describing a possibility and starts describing an object moving down a river, the situation has already crossed from forecast into event. Kerr County, Comal County, the Guadalupe River. If those names carry a weight for you, if something tightens a little when you hear them together with the word flood, that is not an accident, and we are going to talk about why. But even if they mean nothing to you yet, look at what the map was doing. This was not one storm over one town. This was a corridor, a whole belt of Texas, running along and just west of the line where the flat country rises up into the hills, was flooding at the same time along a dozen different rivers, and the sky was not done with it. I want to give you one more piece of this morning before we pull back and start making sense of it, because it reframes the scale. This was not just a Texas problem measured in Texas terms. Step back to the national picture. The total number of active weather alerts of every kind across the entire United States on a normal day sits at a certain baseline. In roughly 24 hours, that national total surged to somewhere between 421 and 422 active alert products, a jump of around 130 alerts in a single day, an increase of about 45%. And of every state in the country, the one carrying the most alert products was Texas, with 55. Nearly half of a single day's enormous jump in weather warnings for the entire nation was tied to what was happening in and around this one flooding corridor. So here is where we stand at the end of the first piece of this. We have a flood already in progress, being fed by a forecast of 6 to 8 inches more, locally past 10, onto ground with nothing left to give. We have rivers with names that Texans say quietly, already carrying dangerous walls of moving water. We have a single county reporting anywhere from 3 to 15 inches of rain, and we have a national weather system lighting up, with Texas at the center of it. The obvious question is when it stops, but that is the small question. The real one, the one that actually explains what you are looking at, is why it is here at all. Why this specific stretch of Texas, again, and why the water comes not as a slow rise but as a wave. Because the answer to that is not in today's forecast. It is in the ground itself, and it has been waiting there for millions of years. Part 2. A map of rivers that should not all be flooding at once. Pull back from any single warning and look at the whole map of Texas rivers on the morning of July 16th, and you notice something that should not be possible. They were nearly all going up at the same time, not one river fed by one storm, but a fan of separate rivers, draining separate valleys, spread across a wide stretch of the state, every one of them carrying flood warnings on the same morning. When that happens, it is telling you that the thing driving the water is bigger than any one thunderstorm. It is telling you the whole region is being loaded at once. Start with the one that was already at the top of the scale. The Nueces River, below the town of Uvalde, was in major flooding. I need you to understand what that phrase means in the language the Weather Service uses, because these words are not chosen loosely. The agency sorts river flooding into categories, and they climb from minor to moderate to major. Minor flooding is water in low spots, over some roads, an inconvenience with an edge to it. Moderate flooding starts reaching structures and forcing people out of low areas. Major flooding is the top category. It means extensive inundation, serious threat to life and property, the kind of flooding that rewrites the day for everyone near the water, and the Nueces below Uvalde was already there, major flooding occurring and forecast to continue, while more rain was still falling upstream. The worst category reached before the day's rain had even finished. Think for a moment about what that single designation implies on the ground. Major flooding on a river below a town means the water is out of its banks and into places it does not normally reach, threatening structures, cutting off roads, and putting anyone in the lowlands at genuine risk. And this was on the Nueces below Uvalde, a river and a county name that, like the Guadalupe, carries its own weight in the memory of this region. For the top flood category to be reached and forecast to continue while the upstream rain was still falling, tells you the system had already blown past the warning stage and into the emergency stage, with more water still on the way down from above. The Nueces was not alone in its own watershed. At Laguna upstream, the Nueces was in moderate flooding. Further down, near Asherton in Dimmick County, moderate flooding was forecast as the water worked its way south. Trace those points in order, from Laguna down past Uvalde to Asherton, and you are watching a flood travel. The same slug of water moving down the river system stage by stage, hitting moderate flooding here, major flooding there, then moderate again further down as it spreads out. That is the flood wave made visible across a whole watershed, one body of water working its way toward the coast, forcing a new warning at each community it reaches. The Sabinal River, at the town of Sabinal, was forecast to reach major flooding, with the warning noting that at a stage of 20 feet the water spreads into the lowlands. The Frio River at Tilden, in McMullen and Live Oak counties, carried a flood warning too, minor for now but with moderate flooding waiting at 26 feet. 4 different points on the Nueces and its sister rivers, all rising together because the rain that feeds them had fallen across the whole upper watershed at once. Now move north and east, and you find the Llano River doing the same thing in 2 places. Near Mason, in Mason County, the Llano was under a flood warning for minor flooding running through Friday evening, with moderate lowland flooding waiting at 24 feet. Near Junction, in Kimball County, another warning, minor flooding forecast with the water reaching lowlands at 16 feet. And then the San Antonio River down at Goliad, draining a set of counties toward the coast, forecast for minor flooding with the explicit note that moderate flooding was possible. Every one of these is a separate river, every one of them was rising on the same morning, and every one of them sits inside the same corridor of Texas. Notice too how the timing of the warnings tells its own story about the pace of this thing. The flash flood warnings were written to expire in a matter of hours, one until 2 in the afternoon, another until 1:15, another until 1:30, the short windows you use for a threat that is happening right now and moving fast. But the warning tied to the flood wave on the Guadalupe, through Comal and Kendall counties, was set to run until 10:15 that night. That is not a short fuse warning for a passing cell. That is an acknowledgement that a mass of water was going to keep travelling and keep threatening for the rest of the day and into the night, long after the rain that spawned it had moved on. The river flood warnings ran longer still, some of them stretching into the following day and beyond, because the rivers themselves would take that long to crest and recede. The clock on each warning is a clue to what kind of danger it describes, and the clocks on July 16th range from the immediate to the multi-day all at once. And through the middle of all of it, the Guadalupe, carrying that dangerous flood wave we started with, the river the warnings singled out with the most urgent language of the day. A moving surge, not a slow rise, tracked by emergency managers as it travelled downstream through Kerr County and Kendall County and Comal County, with warnings extended late into the night. Put your finger on each of those rivers on a map and something jumps out. The Guadalupe, the Nueces, the Sabinal, the Frio, the Llano, the San Antonio. They are not scattered randomly across Texas. They line up. They fall along a band that runs from the hills west and north of San Antonio, down and across a strip of the state that follows a very particular geological line. That alignment is not a coincidence, and it is the single most important thing to understand about why this keeps happening. These rivers flood together because they were built by the same landscape to do exactly that, and we are going to open that landscape up in the next part. But first, finish taking the measure of the day, because the human scale of it is written in the warning counts. Remember that national number, somewhere between 421 and 422 active weather alerts across the entire country, up about 130 in a single day. When you break that down by state, Texas held 55 active alert products, more than any other state in the nation. Think about what that means. On a day when the whole country was unusually active, when heat warnings covered the northern plains and smoke alerts covered the northeast, the single largest concentration of weather warnings in America was tied to this flooding corridor. The alerts were not evenly spread. They were pooled, right here, over the water. And it is worth remembering that 55 of those alert products belong to Texas, not because Texas is simply large, but because the flooding had concentrated so much danger into one region that a single state was generating warning after warning, county after county, river after river. Compare that to how the rest of the country's alerts were distributed on the same day, spread across heat in the northern plains, smoke in the northeast, scattered severe weather here and there, and the Texas number stands out as a dense cluster rather than a broad smear. When one state holds the single largest share of the nation's active warnings, and those warnings are overwhelmingly about water, the map is telling you exactly where the emergency is. That surge in the national count is worth pausing on as its own signal. The jump from around 290 alerts the day before to more than 420 represents an increase of roughly 45% in about 24 hours. Weather does not usually move that fast at the national scale because the country is big and its weather is varied, and it takes a genuinely large organised event to swing the total that much in a day. A 45% jump means a lot of separate warnings were issued in a short window, and a huge share of them were flood warnings pointed at the same part of the same state. The number is a thermometer for how concentrated and how sudden this was. There was one more hazard riding along with the water, and it is worth noting because it shows the atmosphere over Texas was not just wet, it was unstable. A brief tornado or two was considered possible in south-central Texas that morning, and the day before a tornado had actually crossed Loop 1604 west of Shavano Park in Bezar County, right on the edge of the San Antonio metro, with debris and power flashes captured on video. A tornado is not the flood, and I do not want to blur the two. But the same warm, moisture-drenched, unstable air mass that spins up a tornado is the air mass that feeds torrential rain, and finding both in the same place on back-to-back days tells you The atmosphere here was fully charged. The flood was the main event, but it was not happening in a quiet sky. So let me consolidate what the map is telling us, because it sets up the real question. We have at least half a dozen separate rivers under flood warnings at once, one of them already at the major category, another carrying a moving wall of water. We have those rivers lined up along a single geological band rather than scattered at random. We have a national weather system with its single largest cluster of warnings pooled directly over this corridor after a 45% one-day jump, and we have a sky unstable enough to drop a tornado on the edge of San Antonio the day before. Every piece of that points in the same direction. Something about this specific place gathers water and danger and concentrates them, over and over, in a way that the rest of the country simply does not experience. Which brings us to the thing I have been promising. All of these rivers flood together, in this pattern, along this line, because of a feature in the ground beneath them that most people driving through the Texas hill country have never heard of and could not see if they were staring right at it. It has a name. It is called the Balconies Escarpment, and it is, more than the storms, more than the season, more than anything you will read in a daily forecast, the reason the water comes here as a wave. To understand why the rain over Texas won't stop, and why the answer is worse than the flooding, we have to stop looking at the sky and start looking at the rock. Part 3. The line in the ground called Flash Flood Alley. If you drove across central Texas from the coast heading northwest, you would feel the change before you understood it. For a long time the land is flat, the soil is deep, the roads run straight, and the country rolls gently. Then, somewhere around a line that passes near San Antonio and Austin, the land tilts up. The flat coastal plain gives way to higher, rougher country, cut with canyons and studded with limestone, and the rivers you cross start running through steeper valleys. That change you would feel under your tires has a name. It is the Balconies Escarpment, and it is a geological fault zone, a place where the Earth's crust long ago cracked and shifted, dropping the coastal plain on one side and lifting the hill country on the other. Spanish explorers named it for the way the ridgeline looked like a series of balconies. It is one of the defining features of the Texas landscape, and almost nobody thinks about it right up until the water comes. The escarpment is not a single cliff you could photograph. It is a zone of faulting, tens of miles wide in places, where the crust was stretched and broken millions of years ago, dropping the Gulf side down and leaving the Edwards Plateau standing higher to the west. Over the ages, water carved into that boundary, exposing the limestone and cutting the canyons that give the hill country its shape. The rock at the surface across much of this region is that same limestone, porous and hard, and it does two things that matter enormously for flooding. In some places it swallows water into caves and springs, which is why this region also feeds famous clear springs. But at the surface, on the slopes, where the soil covering it is thin, it turns much of a heavy rain straight into runoff. The very geology that makes the hill country's water so clear and its springs so beautiful is the geology that makes its floods so fast. Here is why that ridge matters more than any single storm. Moisture for these floods comes up from the Gulf of Mexico, warm and heavy and low to the ground, riding north on the wind. When that thick, wet air reaches the Balconies Escarpment, it hits the rising terrain and has nowhere to go but up. Air that is forced to climb cools. Air that cools cannot hold as much water, and water that the air can no longer hold falls out as rain. This is one of the most basic engines in all of weather, the lifting of moist air over higher ground, and the Balconies Escarpment is a nearly perfect machine for doing it. The escarpment stands right where the wettest Gulf air arrives, and it wrings that air out like a hand closing around a soaked cloth. That is the first reason the rain concentrates here. The land itself reaches up and pulls it down, but lifting the rain out of the sky is only half of what makes this the most dangerous flash flood country in North America. The other half is what happens to that rain once it hits the ground, and this is where the hill country turns genuinely treacherous. Think about where rain goes when it lands. On deep, soft soil, a lot of it soaks in. The ground acts like a sponge, absorbing the water, slowing it down, releasing it gradually into streams over hours and days. That absorption is a buffer. It is the thing that keeps most heavy rain from becoming a flash flood. Now take that sponge away. In much of the hill country, the soil is thin, sometimes only inches deep, laid over hard limestone bedrock. There is almost no sponge. When the rain falls, the ground cannot take it in, so nearly all of it runs off across the surface immediately, the way water runs off a tile floor rather than sinking into a carpet. And the terrain decides where that running water goes. The hill country is not flat. It is steep and folded, cut by countless creeks, and draws that all feed downhill into narrow river valleys. So the rain that cannot soak in slides off the slopes, gathers in the draws, and funnels into those narrow valleys from every direction at once. Water that would spread out and slow down on a broad, flat floodplain instead gets squeezed into tight channels. Squeeze a large volume of fast-moving water into a narrow space, and it does not have room to spread, so it does the only thing it can. It rises. Fast. This is the recipe. A landscape that pulls extra rain out of the sky, refuses to absorb it, and then channels every bit of it into narrow valleys where it has nowhere to go but up and downstream. There is a second, subtler ingredient the escarpment adds, and it has to do with where the wettest air of all likes to go. The same lifting that wrings rain out of moist air also helps thunderstorms build tall and intense, because rising air is exactly what a thunderstorm needs to grow. So the escarpment does not just increase the total rainfall, it can help organize and energize the storms themselves, giving them the upward push to reach their most productive, rain-heavy form right as they cross the corridor. The land is not a passive victim of the storms. It actively helps make them worse, lifting the air, wringing out the water, and energizing the very cells that will flood its valleys. Few landscapes on the continent are so perfectly, unfortunately configured to convert a warm, wet wind off an ocean into a killing flood. Hydrologists have a nickname for the corridor this creates. They call it Flash Flood Alley. It runs roughly from north of Dallas, down through the hill country, to San Antonio, following that Balcones line, and it is widely described as one of the most flash flood-prone regions in all of North America. By some measures, the most dangerous of all. The rivers we listed in the last part, the Guadalupe, the Nueces, the Sabinal, the Frio, the Llano, the San Antonio, are not a random collection. They are the rivers of Flash Flood Alley. They flooded together on July 16th because they are all children of the same escarpment, all fed by the same thin-soiled, steep, water-shedding terrain, all built by geology to gather rain fast and move it faster. Once you see this, the map from the last part stops being mysterious. Of course the rivers were all rising at once. They were all being loaded by the same feature, the same lifting of Gulf air over the same ridge, the same inability of the same rock to absorb the same rain. The escarpment does not care that these are separate watersheds with separate names. To the escarpment, they are all just channels for shedding water off the hills, and when the sky delivers enough moisture at once, they all do their job at the same time. The pattern that looked impossible from the sky makes perfect sense from the ground. And this is the beginning of the answer that the title promised is worse than the flooding. Because a flood caused by a freak storm is a piece of bad luck. It happens, it is terrible, and then it is over, and there is no particular reason to expect it again in that exact spot. But a flood caused by the permanent shape of the land is not luck at all. The Balcones escarpment is not going anywhere. The thin soils and the limestone and the steep, narrow valleys are not going to deepen or soften. This corridor will pull Gulf moisture out of the sky and refuse to absorb it and funnel it into rising rivers for as long as the escarpment exists, which is to say, effectively forever on any human timescale. The flooding on July 16th was not the escarpment misbehaving. It was the escarpment doing exactly what it does, exactly what it has done since long before anyone was here to name its rivers. That is a harder truth to sit with than a story about one bad storm, because it means the danger is not an event, it is a permanent condition of the place. But we're still missing a crucial piece, because knowing that the water runs off fast does not fully explain the thing that scares the people who live here most. It does not explain why the water arrives as a wall. A steep watershed sheds water quickly, yes, but there is a specific reason these particular rivers can go from a lazy summer trickle to a killing torrent in the space of minutes, faster than a person can climb to safety, faster sometimes than a warning can reach them. That mechanism, the reason a hill country river rises not like a filling bathtub but like a slammed door, is where the true edge of this danger lives, and it is where we're going next. Part 4. Why the river rises like a slammed door. There is a specific kind of fear that people who grew up in the hill country carry, and it is different from the fear of a hurricane or a blizzard. A hurricane announces itself for days, a blizzard you can watch approach. but the flood that kills you in Flash Flood Alley can come out of a sky that, where you're standing, looks fine. You can be at a river crossing on a warm afternoon, the water low and clear and inviting with blue sky overhead, and be dead within minutes because of rain that fell somewhere you could not see. To understand why the answer here is worse than the flooding, you have to understand that mechanism, because it is the reason this landscape kills in a way that few others do. Let me build it piece by piece. In the last part we established that the rain runs off fast, because the thin soil over limestone cannot absorb it, and the steep terrain funnels it into narrow valleys. Now add the element of time, and specifically the element of distance. A river drains a large area, called a watershed, everything uphill that sheds water into it. When a storm parks over the upper part of a watershed, all that rain runs off the slopes and gathers into the channel and starts travelling downstream as a connected mass of water. Because the terrain is steep, that water moves quickly, and because the valley is narrow, the water cannot spread out to lose its energy. So instead of dispersing, it stays bunched together, a surge of water travelling down the river channel like a pulse, moving through a vein. That is the flood wave. That is the exact thing the emergency managers reported on the Guadalupe on July 16th, a dangerous flood wave moving down the river. It is not the river uniformly rising everywhere at once. It is a distinct mass of water, sometimes described by survivors as a wall, travelling downstream and arriving at a given spot suddenly. And here is the part that makes it lethal. That wall can be arriving at a point on the river where it is not even raining. The storm dropped its water miles upstream over the top of the watershed, and the wave has been travelling ever since. So a family at a crossing far downstream, under clear sky, gets no warning from the weather around them. The first sign is the water itself, already rising, already fast, already too high to cross and climbing by the second. The speed of it defeats human instinct. We are used to floods that give us time. We expect that if water is rising, we can watch it and judge when to move. In the hill country, that instinct is a trap, because the river can go from ankle deep to over your head in the span of a few minutes when the wave arrives. Consider the physics of what moving water does to a human being and a vehicle. Because the numbers are more alarming than most people realize, it takes surprisingly little to sweep you off your feet. Water only a couple of feet deep, moving at the speed of a hill country flood wave, exerts enough force to knock an adult down and carry them away, and once you are off your feet in fast water, you have almost no ability to recover. A vehicle is worse, not better, because it floats. A foot or two of moving water can lift a car and float it off the road, and at that point the 2-ton machine that felt like safety becomes a sealed box being carried downstream by a current the driver cannot fight. This is why so many flash flood deaths happen to people in vehicles. They trusted the car to get them through water that a person on foot would never have waded into, and the car, buoyant and heavy and hard to escape, betrayed them. The force is not intuitive. We look at a foot of water across a road and our brain says shallow crossable, when the honest reading is lethal. Rises of many feet in a very short time are a documented feature of these rivers. A channel that was a shallow summer creek in the morning can be a churning brown torrent by afternoon, carrying whole trees and debris, moving fast enough to sweep a vehicle off a road or knock a standing adult off their feet. Moving water is deceptively powerful. It does not take much depth or much speed to lift a car, and once it does, the person inside has almost no options left. There is a way to picture this that makes the danger vivid. Imagine standing beside a hill country creek and watching a graph of its water level over the course of an afternoon. On a normal river, on a broad floodplain, that line would climb like a gentle hill, rising over many hours, giving you all the time in the world to read it and react. On one of these flashy hill country streams, the same graph does not climb like a hill. It climbs like a wall. The line stays flat, 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 and then it goes nearly vertical, jumping a stage of several feet in a span of minutes as the flood wave arrives, before eventually falling almost as sharply once the wave passes. Hydrologists literally see this in the river gauge records, a near vertical spike where the water went from placid to deadly in the time it takes to have a conversation. That vertical wall on the graph is the shape of the danger, and it is why a warning that reaches you even 15 minutes late can be a warning that reaches you too late. This is why one particular piece of hill country infrastructure shows up again and again in the story of these floods: the low water crossing. Across this region, because the terrain is so cut up by creeks and draws, countless roads simply dip down and cross the stream bed directly, with no bridge, because building a bridge over every minor draw would be impossible. On a normal day, these crossings are dry, or carry an inch of water, and you drive across without a thought. When a flood wave comes down, those same crossings become the most dangerous places in Texas. The water covers the road, often faster than a driver approaching it can perceive, and it hides how deep and how fast it really is. A huge share of flash flood deaths in this region historically happen at these crossings, to people who tried to drive through water that looked crossable and was not. It is the origin of a safety slogan you may have heard, "Turn around, do not drown," and that slogan exists precisely because this landscape produces this exact killing scenario over and over. Now layer that mechanism back onto the specific conditions of July 16th, and the danger sharpens. The ground was already saturated, which means even more of the new rain ran off instead of soaking in, which means the flood waves were fed even more aggressively. The storms were slow moving, which we flagged earlier as the enemy, and now you can see exactly why. A slow storm dumps its rain over one patch of the watershed for a long time instead of spreading it thin as it moves, and that concentrated dump is precisely what builds the biggest, most sudden flood waves. And the rivers were already up, which means the waves were arriving on top of water that was already high, giving people even less margin. Every ingredient that makes a hill country flood deadly was set to its most dangerous position at the same time, and the 3 to 15-inch range from Medina County finally makes complete sense in this light. That spread is what you get when slow, training storms sit over one part of the county and not another. The place that got 15 inches was underneath the parked storm, feeding an enormous flood wave into its local creeks. The place that got 3 inches was just outside it. Someone in that county could have been standing in a hard but survivable rain while a few miles away and a few minutes upstream, a wall of water was already forming that would come down the channel toward crossings and homes with almost no notice. That is the terror of this specific geography. The rain and the killing water are not always in the same place, and the gap between them is measured in minutes. So hold the full picture now. The Balcones escarpment pulls the rain out of the sky. The thin soil and steep terrain refuse to absorb it and funnel it into narrow valleys, and those narrow valleys turn the runoff into fast-moving flood waves that can arrive suddenly, far from where the rain fell, rising feet in minutes, at exactly the low crossings where people are most exposed. That is not a storm, that is a system, and it is built into the ground. This is what the people of the hill country are actually living on top of, and it is why the names of these rivers are spoken with a particular weight. Because this corridor does not just flood, it has a long and painful history of flooding in the deadliest way a river can, and that history is the next thing we need to face, because it is what turns today's warning from a weather event into something that echoes. Part 5. The river's people choose to live beside. There is a cruel irony built into Flash Flood Alley, and it is this. The exact thing that makes this country dangerous is also what makes it beautiful, and what makes people want to live there. The hill country is one of the most beloved landscapes in Texas precisely because of its rivers. The Guadalupe, the Frio, the Llano, the clear water running over limestone under cypress trees, the swimming holes and the campgrounds and the summer towns. Generations of families have come to these rivers to cool off in the heat, and generations have built homes, camps and businesses along their banks. The rivers are the reason the region has a soul, and the reason it has a body count. Because those same postcard rivers are the flood channels. The beautiful clear stream running over limestone is beautiful because the limestone will not let the water soak in, which is the same reason it floods. The cypress-lined banks that people build beside are the narrow valleys that turn runoff into flood waves. Every quality that draws people to the water is a quality that, on the wrong afternoon, turns the water into a threat. And over the decades, more and more people have come. The corridor from San Antonio up through the hill country has been one of the fastest growing parts of the country, with new homes and new roads and new communities spreading across land that the rivers have always claimed on their own schedule whenever the sky delivers. Think about what that growth actually does to the risk, because it works on both sides of the equation at once. On one side, every new subdivision, parking lot and road adds hard, paved surface that water cannot penetrate, which means even more of a heavy rain runs off instead of soaking in, feeding the flood waves faster. Development does not just put people in harm's way, it can deepen the harm by making the runoff worse. On the other side, it simply puts more human beings, more homes, more vehicles, more summer campers and river tubers and weekend visitors directly into the valleys where the flood waves travel. A flood wave coming down an empty canyon a century ago was a natural event that harmed no one. The same wave coming down the same canyon today passes homes, crossings, campgrounds, and roads full of people. The wave has not gotten any more dangerous. The valley has just filled up with things and people for it to reach, and that is a trend line moving in exactly the wrong direction, decade after decade, as the population of Flash Flood Alley climbs. That collision between a permanent natural hazard and a growing human presence is why this region carries the reputation it does. Flash Flood Alley is not just a hydrologist's label for a rainfall pattern. It is a memory held by the people who live there, because the history of these rivers is written in floods that people still talk about, floods that took lives, floods that reshaped towns, floods that are marked by high water lines on old buildings and by the quiet way locals watch the sky in the summer. When an emergency manager on July 16th reported a dangerous flood wave moving down the Guadalupe, that message did not land on people who had never imagined such a thing. It landed on people who carry in their communities and their families a long and specific understanding of exactly what that river can do. That is why the names have weight. The weight is earned. And this is the piece that makes the daily forecast so much heavier than it looks. When you or I read a line like 6 to 8 inches of rain, isolated 10 inches, over the hill country, we might read it as a number. To someone who lives along the Guadalupe or the Nueces, that number is a memory and a warning at the same time. They know that this landscape converts that rain into flood waves. They know where the low crossings are. They know which bend of the river came up in the last bad one. The forecast is not abstract to them, because they live on the receiving end of the machine we have been describing, and they have seen it run before. There is a particular cruelty in how this danger interacts with the calendar. The hill country's flood season peaks in the warm months, late spring through summer and into early fall, precisely when the Gulf is warmest and the moisture is deepest. But those are also the months when the rivers are most crowded, when families are camping on the banks, when children are swimming in the clear water, when the campgrounds and the river outfitters are full. The season of maximum danger and the season of maximum human presence are the same season. The river is most beautiful and most inviting at exactly the time it is most capable of turning into a flood wave. That overlap is not a coincidence of bad luck. It is baked into the nature of the place, and it is a large part of why the floods here, when they turn deadly, so often catch people in the water or beside it rather than safe in their homes. I want to be careful and honest here, because it would be easy to reach for a specific past catastrophe and dramatize it, and that is not what this channel does. The precise details of individual historical floods are their own stories, and I'm not going to put numbers in your head that I cannot stand behind. But the general truth is not in dispute, and it does not need embellishment. This corridor has produced some of the most sudden and deadly flash floods this country has experienced, repeatedly, across its recorded history, and the reason is everything we have already laid out. The escarpment, the thin soil, the steep valleys, the flood waves, the crossings, and the people who, understandably, love and inhabit the very places the water reclaims. Put those together, and you do not get a region that floods occasionally. You get a region that floods as a defining feature of its existence, and that has learned, the hard way, again and again, what that means. So when we ask why the rain over Texas won't stop, we now have the first half of the answer fully in view, and it has nothing to do with the weather at all. It is the ground. This place floods because of what it is, permanently, structurally, unavoidably. The Balcones escarpment will keep pulling Gulf moisture down, the limestone will keep refusing it, the valleys will keep channeling it into waves, and people will keep living beside the rivers, because the rivers are why the place is worth living in. That is the standing condition, that is the loaded gun, and it is always loaded every summer, waiting only for the sky to pull the trigger. But a loaded gun still needs a trigger, and that is the half of the answer we have not yet touched. The escarpment explains why the water is dangerous when it comes. It does not explain why, on this particular week, in this particular July, the rain kept coming and would not move on. Geology sets the stage, but geology does not decide when the storms arrive or how long they linger. For that, we have to leave the ground and go back up into the sky, and we have to ask a very specific question. Not why does the hill country flood, we have answered that, but why right now are the storms parking over it and refusing to leave? Because a storm that moves through drops its rain and passes. A storm that stalls drops its rain in one place until something breaks. And the storms of July 16th were stalling. The question is what was holding them there. Part 6. The storms that refuse to move. Watch the language the Weather Service used on July 16th, and one phrase keeps surfacing quietly underneath the alarming ones. Slow-moving. Slow-moving showers and thunderstorms producing very heavy rainfall. It is easy to skip past because it sounds so much less dramatic than a dangerous flood wave. But that phrase is the trigger. If the escarpment is why the water is deadly, slow-moving storms are why there was so much of it, and understanding why storms stall is the first half of answering why the rain would not stop. Think about what determines how much rain falls on a single spot. It is not really about how hard it is raining at any instant. It is about how hard it is raining multiplied by how long the rain sits over that spot. A ferocious downpour that blows through in 10 minutes drops far less total water on your house than a moderate rain that lingers for 6 hours. So the single most important factor in whether heavy rain becomes a flood is not intensity, it is duration. And duration is controlled by how fast the storms are moving. A storm that races across the landscape spreads its rain out over a long path, giving any one place only a brief soaking. A storm that barely moves dumps everything it has onto the same ground, over and over, until that ground is overwhelmed. Now add the worst version of this, which is what was happening across the hill country. It is called training. The word comes from the image of railroad cars, one after another, all running down the same track past the same point. In the atmosphere, training happens when individual thunderstorm cells form, move along a certain path dropping their rain, and are then replaced by new cells that form in the same starting place and follow the exact same path. Each individual storm might move along at a reasonable speed, but because a new one keeps forming behind it and taking the same route, the effect on the ground underneath is relentless. One cell after another passes over the same neighborhoods, the same creeks, the same crossings, like train cars over a track, and the rain totals in that narrow band climb into the range that produces catastrophe. 10, 12, 15 inches, while a town a few miles off the track stays comparatively dry. That is what produced the 3 to 15 inch spread in Medina County. That is what feeds the biggest flood waves. Training storms are, more than anything else, the specific atmospheric behavior that turns Flash Flood Alley from a place that could flood into a place that is flooding. And they require a particular kind of setup to happen. They need a steady supply of moisture flowing in to keep building new cells, and they need something to anchor the path so that each new cell forms in the same place and travels the same line. Take away either ingredient and the training stops. The storms either run out of fuel or start moving off. On July 16th, both ingredients were locked in, and that is the heart of why the rain would not stop. Start with the fuel. The moisture feeding these storms comes from the Gulf of Mexico, and in midsummer that supply is deep and warm and nearly bottomless. Warm ocean water evaporates readily, loading the low-level air with water vapor, and the prevailing flow carries that saturated air north into Texas. As long as that pipeline from the Gulf stays open, the storms have an essentially unlimited reservoir to draw from. New cells can keep forming because there is always more moist air arriving to build them. This is why the worst hill country floods are summer events. The Gulf is at its warmest, the air it delivers is at its wettest, and the fuel tank for training storms is full. There is a way meteorologists measure just how loaded that incoming air is, a quantity called precipitable water, which is essentially the total amount of moisture stacked in a column of the atmosphere overhead. The amount of rain you would get if you could wring every drop out of the sky above a single point. When precipitable water values climb toward the top of what the season can produce, it means the air is nearly saturated from the ground up, holding close to the maximum water it can carry. Storms feeding on air that rich or extraordinarily efficient rain producers, because there is so much moisture available to condense out. The Gulf in midsummer routinely delivers air near those high values, and that is the difference between a storm that drops half an inch and a storm that drops 5. The rain rate in a training storm over saturated Gulf air can reach several inches per hour, and when cell after cell trains over the same ground at that rate, the totals we saw on July 16th, 6, 8, 10, even 15 inches, are not surprising. They are the arithmetic of intensity multiplied by duration, both dialed to their extremes. Then there is the anchor, the thing that holds the storms in place instead of letting them sweep away. And this is about the larger scale pattern of the atmosphere, the high altitude winds that steer weather systems along. When those steering winds are strong, storms get pushed along briskly and cannot linger. When those steering winds go slack, when the upper level pattern stalls out and the flow that would normally shove weather from west to east weakens or gets blocked, storms lose the push that moves them. They sit, they train, they dump. A stalled steering pattern is to a flash flood what a jammed accelerator is to a car. It removes the thing that would carry the danger away and lets it run in place. Why does the steering flow go slack in the first place? It comes down to the behaviour of the jet stream, the ribbon of fast wind high in the atmosphere that normally marches weather systems along from west to east. When the jet is strong and relatively straight, it acts like a conveyor belt, keeping storms moving. But the jet does not always run straight. It buckles into big north-south waves, ridges of high pressure bulging north, and troughs of low pressure dipping south. And sometimes those waves grow so large and so slow that they essentially stop progressing, locking into place for days or even weeks. When that happens, the weather underneath each part of the wave gets stuck too. Under a ridge, you bake. Near a trough, storms fire and refuse to move. A stalled jet stream wave is the large-scale reason a pattern locks, and a locked pattern is the reason storms train over one spot long enough to flood it. If that idea of a stuck stalled pattern sounds familiar, it should, because we have been tracking exactly that behaviour in this same summer over recent weeks. In the video a few days ago about the pattern locking in for the last stretch of July, the whole story was an atmosphere that had stopped progressing the way it normally does, with ridges and troughs parking in place instead of marching along, producing repeating rounds of the same weather over the same regions. A stalled pattern does not just bake one place under heat while it happens. On its wet edge, it also holds storms in place over another, and that is what a flooding hill country represents. It is the wet expression of the same stuck atmosphere that, elsewhere, was locking in heat. The storms over Texas were not moving on because the larger flow that would have moved them on had gone slack. So now the phrase, "Why won't the rain stop?" has a real, physical answer, and it has two layers. The rain will not stop moment to moment, because slow-moving, training storms keep forming over the same ground, fed by an open pipeline of Gulf moisture, and anchored by a stalled steering pattern that will not push them along, and the water will not stop being dangerous, no matter what, because the escarpment and the thin soil and the narrow valleys convert every inch of that rain into fast rising flood waves. Geology and atmosphere, working together, one providing the killing terrain and the other providing the endless stationary rain. That would be a complete enough answer if this were happening in isolation, a bad but bounded event driven by a stuck weather pattern over a flood-prone region. But it is not happening in isolation, and here is where the story takes its harder turn. Because there is a third layer underneath the geology and the stalled pattern, a background condition that has been quietly changing the rules for how much water these storms can carry in the first place. The escarpment is the same as it has always been, but the sky feeding it is not, and that change is the part of this that should genuinely keep you up at night. Part 7. The Heavier Sky. Every flood we have described so far runs on water vapour, the invisible moisture in the air that storms wring out as rain. And there is one iron rule about water vapour that governs everything, a rule so fundamental it was worked out in physics more than a century and a half ago. Warm air can hold more of it, cool air can hold less. It is the reason a cold glass sweats on a summer day, the reason your breath fogs in winter, and it is the reason the temperature of the atmosphere quietly controls the ceiling on how much rain a storm can ever produce. If you want to understand why the floods of this era feel like they keep breaking the mould, you have to understand that the sky itself has been getting warmer and therefore heavier with water than it used to be. To see how loaded the current sky is, look at what the broader ocean and atmosphere have been doing this year, because there is a specific measurement that captures it. Climate scientists track a number called the Oceanic Niño Index, which measures the temperature of a key region of the tropical Pacific Ocean against its long-term average. That number is the heartbeat of the pattern we call El Niño and its cool counterpart La Niña. When the index is well below zero, the Pacific is in its cool phase. When it climbs above a certain threshold and stays there, the world has tipped into El Niño, which tends to pump extra heat and moisture into the global atmosphere and reshuffle weather patterns across the planet. Here is what that number has done in a startlingly short span. Going back through the recent seasons, the index read minus 0.54, then minus 0.37, then plus 0.51, and most recently, for the April through June period of this year, plus 0.98. Follow that arc. It went from clearly negative, cool Pacific, La Niña territory, all the way up to nearly a full degree above average, solidly into El Niño conditions. The total swing across those seasons was 1.52 degrees Celsius, a lurch from one side of the scale to the other in a remarkably compressed window. The Pacific did not drift, it jumped. There is a reason a change in one patch of the Pacific reaches all the way to a river in the Texas Hill Country, and it has a name, teleconnection, the idea that a shift in ocean temperature in one part of the world reshapes the atmosphere far away. When the tropical Pacific warms, it changes where thunderstorms cluster over that ocean, and that in turn nudges the great rivers of high-altitude wind, the jet streams, that steer weather across the hemisphere. El Niño tends to strengthen and shift the subtropical jet in ways that, historically, have favoured wetter, stormier conditions across the southern tier of the United States, Texas very much included. It is not a switch that guarantees any single flood. It is a thumb leaning on the whole system, tilting the odds toward more storminess in exactly the part of the country we're talking about. That jump matters for a flooding Texas for two connected reasons. The first is direct. A warmer tropical Pacific, and the El Niño it produces, tends to add heat and available moisture to the atmosphere over large parts of the world, and it can shift the tracks and behaviour of storm systems, including in ways that favour wetter conditions across parts of the southern United States. The details are complex and no single flood can be pinned entirely on El Niño, but the broad tilt of the board matters, and right now the board is tilted toward an atmosphere carrying more energy and more water than it was carrying a year ago, when that same index sat in negative territory. And the speed of the flip is its own signal. To move from minus 0.54 to plus 0.98 in the span of about 3 seasons is not a gentle seasonal drift. It is the climate system lurching from one state to another quickly, and rapid transitions tend to produce a restless, volatile atmosphere while everything readjusts, exactly the kind of atmosphere that stalls, whiplashes, and stacks extremes. It is worth being clear-eyed about the limits of that first reason, because El Niño is a tilt, not a guarantee, and its effects on any single storm are impossible to isolate cleanly. Plenty of Texas floods have happened in neutral years and in La Niña years, because the escarpment does not check the state of the Pacific before it rings out a storm. So I am not telling you El Niño caused this flood. What I am telling you is that the broad conditions were leaning wet across the southern tier at the same moment this flood occurred, and that a leaning system produces more chances for the local machinery to line up badly. It is the difference between loading a schedule with more opportunities for something to go wrong and actually pulling the trigger on any one of them. The trigger is still local, the loading is regional, and right now the region was loaded. The second reason is the one that ties back to the iron rule about water vapour, and it is the more important of the two. That rising index is a marker of a warming system, and a warming system means warmer air, and warmer air means a higher ceiling on rainfall. This is the background condition I flagged at the end of the last part, the thing that is changing the rules underneath the escarpment and the stalled storms. The geology is fixed. The storms will stall whenever the pattern lets them. But the amount of water those stalled storms have available to dump has been creeping upward, because the air feeding them is warmer and can hold more moisture than the same summer storms could a generation ago. Think about what that does to a place like Flash Flood Alley specifically. This is a landscape that was already, by its raw geology, one of the most efficient flood-producing machines in North America. It was already primed to take whatever rain the sky delivered and convert it into deadly flood waves. Now imagine feeding that same machine a sky that can deliver more rain per storm than it used to. You're not changing the machine. You're increasing the raw material you pour into it. The escarpment does not need help being dangerous, but a heavier atmosphere hands it more water to work with, and the machine faithfully converts every additional inch into additional flood. This is why the floods of Flash Flood Alley in this era are not simply a continuation of the floods of the past. The corridor has always flooded, catastrophically, going back as far as the record runs. That is the permanent condition. But the ceiling on the worst-case rainfall, the absolute most a stalled storm complex can drop, rises with the temperature of the air, and so the region's floods are, on average and over time, being handed the fuel to reach higher than they used to. The same geography, plus a heavier sky, does not equal the same floods. It equals floods with a higher ceiling, on a landscape that was already the worst place in the country for them to happen. I want to be precise and not overstate, because this channel does not deal in doom for its own sake. No individual flood, including this one, can be fully attributed to a warming atmosphere, and floods this severe have happened here in cooler decades too. The escarpment alone is enough to produce disaster. The point is not that warming created the July 16th flood. The point is subtler and, in a way, heavier. It is that the baseline conditions this flood emerged from are shifting in a consistent direction, toward an atmosphere that carries more water, so that over the long run the dice are being loaded. And that phrase, loading the dice, is not just a metaphor. There is an actual number attached to how much heavier each degree of warming makes the sky. And once you see that number, the phrase the answer is worse than the flooding stops being a tease and becomes something you can measure. That number is where we go next. Part 8. 7%. Here is the number. For every 1 degree Celsius that the air warms, it can hold roughly 7% more water vapor. That is it. That is the whole thing. It comes from a relationship in physics called the Clausius-Clapeyron equation, worked out in the 1800s, and it is about as close to unbreakable as science gets. It is not a projection or a model or a matter of debate. It is a property of water and air, as reliable as the fact that water boils or that ice floats. Warm the air by a degree, and its capacity to carry moisture goes up by about 7%. Warm it by 2, and you are near 14. The sky's ability to hold water scales directly with its temperature, and the relationship is steep. The reason this relationship is so trustworthy is that it comes straight out of the fundamental thermodynamics of how water and air interact, not out of any climate model. It describes the maximum amount of water vapor a parcel of air can hold at a given temperature, and it has been confirmed in laboratories countless times. That is what makes it such a solid floor under the whole argument. You can debate the details of how storms will change, or how patterns will shift, and reasonable scientists do. But the basic fact that warmer air holds more water, by about 7% per degree, is not up for debate any more than the boiling point of water is. It is a fixed property of the physical world, and it is quietly rewriting the ceiling on rainfall everywhere the air is warming, including directly over Flash Flood Alley. 7% might not sound like much. If your paycheck went up 7%, you would be pleased but not stunned. But in the context of extreme rainfall, that 7% is doing something more dangerous than a raise, because of where it lands. It does not just raise the average rain, it raises the ceiling on the most extreme events, the very heaviest downpours, and it often raises them by even more than 7%, because the most intense storms are the ones best able to reach up and grab all that extra available moisture and dump it. The gentle rains do not change much. The monsters change the most. And Flash Flood Alley is a place whose entire disaster profile is written by the monsters, by the handful of most extreme rainfall events that produce the killing floods. So a change that most affects the worst storms is a change that most affects exactly this region. Let me make that concrete with the arithmetic, because the numbers are not abstract once you connect them. Take a storm capable of dropping 10 inches of rain. Warm the air feeding it by a single degree Celsius, and its moisture capacity rises by roughly 7%, which on a 10-inch storm is another 7/10 of an inch of potential rain, and on the most intense events the real-world increase can run higher than the baseline 7%, because those storms are the most efficient at reaching for the extra moisture. 7/10 of an inch may sound trivial until you remember where it is landing, on thin soil that absorbs almost nothing, funneled into a narrow valley, added to the top of a flood wave that is already cresting. In a system with no margin, the marginal inch is the one that overtops the bank, that covers the crossing a few minutes sooner, that pushes a river from the moderate category into the major one. The extra water does not spread out harmlessly. It goes straight to the part of the flood that hurts. This is what people mean when they say a warming climate loads the dice for extreme rainfall, and now you can see it is not a vague slogan. It is a specific, physical, quantifiable mechanism. Every degree the atmosphere warms adds about 7% to the reservoir of water the biggest storms can wring out. You're not guaranteed a flood on any given day. The dice still have to be rolled, which is to say the storms still have to form and stall and train. But the dice themselves have been weighted, so that when a bad roll comes, it can come up worse than a bad roll would have a few decades ago. The floor of ordinary weather barely moves. The ceiling of catastrophe rises. Put that mechanism on top of everything we have already built, and the full structure of this disaster finally stands complete. All three levels of it. Level 1, the permanent geology. The Balcanis escarpment lifts Gulf moisture and rains it out. The thin soil over limestone refuses to absorb it, and the steep, narrow valleys concentrate the runoff into fast, deadly flood waves. This never changes. Level 2, the atmospheric pattern of the moment. A stalled steering flow lets storms park and train over the same ground, while an open pipeline of warm Gulf moisture feeds them without limit, so the rain keeps falling on the same spots for hours. This changes day to day and is why some summers are worse than others. And level 3, the shifting baseline. A warming atmosphere marked by that lurch in the Pacific into strong El Niño territory carries more water vapor for the storms to convert into rain by about 7% per degree, raising the ceiling on the worst events. This changes slowly over decades, and it is quietly making level 2 more dangerous every year it continues. Now you can feel the full weight of the title. Why won't the rain over Texas stop? On the surface, because the storms are stalled and the Gulf is feeding them. One level down, because this corridor is built by geology to gather and concentrate every drop into flood waves, so the water is always dangerous here no matter what. And one level below that, the answer that is genuinely worse than the flooding. The rain, the flooding, the dangerous flood wave on the Guadalupe, all of it is the surface expression of a system whose ceiling is rising. The individual flood recedes. The machine that produced it not only remains, it is being fed a heavier and heavier sky. The flood is the event, the rising ceiling is the condition, and the condition does not turn around when the sun comes out tomorrow. That is a heavy thing to carry, so let me be careful about what it does and does not mean, because the honest version is more useful than the frightening one. It does not mean every summer storm is now a catastrophe, or that the hill country is doomed, or that this particular flood was manufactured by warming. Cooler decades produce terrible floods here too, because the geology alone is enough. What it means is narrower and more durable than any single scary claim. It means that the odds are shifting steadily in one direction, and that the shift is grounded in a physical law about water and air that no one disputes. It means that a region already living on top of the worst flood machine in the country is being handed, year by year, a slightly heavier sky to feed it. Not every roll of the dice is a disaster, but the dice are not the dice they used to be. There is one more layer to this that makes it stranger still, and it is the layer that ties this flooding Texas to a story we have been telling all summer about the exact opposite problem. Because the same warming that loads the sky with more water for a flood is also the warming that dries out the ground and deepens droughts elsewhere, sometimes in the very same state, sometimes in the very same month. The atmosphere that can dump 15 inches on Medina County is the same atmosphere that has left most of the country parched. Flood and drought are not opposites fighting each other. They are two faces of one overloaded system, and to see why, we have to look at what the rest of the map looked like on the day Texas was drowning. Part 9, From Drought to Deluge. On the same day that central Texas was under a wall of moving water, most of the United States was too dry. That sounds like a contradiction, and it is one of the most important things to understand about the world we are now living in, so let me give you the actual figures. According to the National Drought Assessment for that week, more than 65% of the continental United States was in some level of abnormal dryness or drought. Nearly 30% was in severe drought or worse. About 1% was in the most extreme category the scale has. A huge fraction of the country was parched, cracking, thirsty, even as the hill country was drowning. And severe drought had actually improved slightly that week, by a bit under 1 percentage point, which tells you the broad national dryness was not some brief blip but a standing condition the rain in Texas barely dented. It is worth breaking that dryness into its layers, because the assessment does not just say dry, it grades it. The mildest category is abnormal dryness, and more than 65% of the lower 48 states carried at least that. Step up to moderate drought or worse, and you're still near 46% of the country. Severe drought or worse covered about 29%. Extreme drought held around 11%. And the most punishing category, exceptional drought, gripped close to 1% of the land. That is a staircase of thirst climbing across most of a continent. And it was the standing state of the country on the very day a slice of Texas was taking on more water than its rivers could carry. Hold those two images side by side, a drowning corridor of Texas rivers and a continent that is mostly too dry. Our instinct is to treat them as opposites that ought to cancel out, as if the country has a fixed amount of water and Texas was simply hogging it. But that is not how the atmosphere works, and the truth is more unsettling. Flood and drought are not enemies taking water from each other. They are both symptoms of the same overloaded, erratic system, and a warming atmosphere tends to intensify both ends at once. The technical shorthand for this is that a warmer climate makes the water cycle more extreme in both directions, wet where it is wet and dry where it is dry, with fewer of the moderate in-between conditions that used to smooth things out. The physics of why is the same 7% we just talked about, seen from the other side. A warmer atmosphere holds more water vapour, which means that when and where it does rain, it can rain harder, producing more intense floods. But that same thirsty warmer air also pulls moisture out of the ground and vegetation more aggressively wherever it is not raining, deepening and accelerating drought. The atmosphere becomes greedier. It sucks water out of the dry places faster and dumps it on the wet places harder. So the same underlying change that raises the ceiling on a Texas flood also raises the intensity of a drought across the plains. One sky, two opposite disasters, both getting worse for the same reason, and this is not a new theme for us. We have spent much of this summer tracking the dry side of that coin. Just over a week ago, we did a whole video on the drought spreading across America and escalating faster than most people realized, on a country where 2/3 of the land was drying out and the West was on fire. The story then was scarcity, water running out, the ground turning to fuel. And here we are, days later, telling what looks like the mirror image story. Too much water, arriving too fast, in one specific corner of the same country. It would be easy to see those as unrelated, a dry story, and then a wet story. They are not. They are the same story told from opposite edges, the story of an atmosphere that has been pushed toward extremes and no longer spends much time in the gentle middle. This is why the phrase weather whiplash has entered the vocabulary of the people who study these things. It describes a rapid swing from one extreme to the other, drought to deluge or deluge to drought. With little of the moderate weather that used to cushion the transition, a region can spend months desperate for rain and then receive a season's worth in a single day, in a form that does more harm than good because it arrives too fast to soak in or be captured. That is not a wetter climate helping a dry one. It is the same overloaded system lurching between extremes, and each lurch carries its own disaster. The drought does not end gently with a soft soaking rain. It ends violently with a flood. There is even a cruel mechanical link between the two, and it sharpens the danger. When ground has been baked hard and dry by drought, it becomes less able to absorb rain when the rain finally comes. A parched, sun-hardened soil can shed water almost like pavement, at least at first before it softens. So a landscape coming off a dry spell can actually produce faster, worse runoff when a heavy rain hits it, because the ground rejects the water instead of soaking it up. In a region like the hill country, where the soil is already thin and non-absorbent to begin with, a dry antecedent period can prime the ground to shed water even more efficiently into the flood channels. Drought does not protect against flood. In this twisted arithmetic, it can help set the flood up. So the picture on July 16th was not a wet country with one dry patch, or a dry country with one wet patch. It was a country locked into extremes at both ends simultaneously, most of it too dry, a slice of Texas catastrophically too wet, and the same warming, erratic atmosphere driving both. That is the signature of the era we are in. Not a uniform shift, not simply hotter or simply wetter, but a widening of the gap between the extremes, with the moderate middle getting squeezed out. The flood and the drought are shaking hands, They always were. Which brings us to a natural and very human response to all of this. When people watch the same region flood over and over, when they watch a country whipsaw between drought and deluge, when the extremes seem to be intensifying in ways that feel unnatural, a lot of them reach for an explanation that puts a hand on the wheel. Someone must be doing this. The storms are being seeded, the weather is being engineered, the floods are being steered. These theories are widespread, they are sincerely believed by a lot of good people, and they deserve to be taken seriously enough to actually examine rather than mocked. So let us examine them honestly, because there is a real kernel buried in one of them, and there is a clear reason none of them explains the wall of water on the Guadalupe. Part 10. The Hand on the Wheel. Whenever the weather turns extreme and stays extreme, a certain set of theories reliably rises with the water, and they all share one emotional core. They say this is not natural, someone is doing it. And the most common version, the one you will hear most often around a Texas flood, is that the storms are being seeded, that human beings are deliberately making it rain harder. I want to take that seriously, because unlike a lot of theories, this one starts from something real, and dismissing it with a wave of the hand would be both dishonest and unpersuasive. Here is the real part. Cloud seeding is a genuine technology, not science fiction, and Texas actually runs licensed weather modification programs. This is not a secret. In parts of the state, aircraft do fly into certain clouds and release small amounts of material, usually silver iodide or similar compounds, to encourage the formation of ice crystals or water droplets, with the goal of coaxing a little more rain out of clouds that are already primed to produce it, typically to help agriculture during dry stretches. So when someone says they seed the clouds in Texas, they are not making that up. They are right. The technology exists and it is used. That is the kernel, and it deserves acknowledgement. It helps to understand what the technology actually does, mechanically, because the mechanism is the ceiling on the theory. Cloud seeding works by giving water in a cloud something to condense or freeze onto. Silver iodide has a crystal structure similar to ice, so when it's introduced into a cloud that is already cold and moist, water can freeze onto it more readily, encouraging droplets or ice crystals to grow large enough to fall. The key phrase is already cold and moist. Seeding cannot conjure moisture that is not there. It can only encourage a cloud that is already primed to rain a bit more, or a bit sooner, than it otherwise would. It is a nudge applied to an existing willing cloud, not a command that summons a storm out of clear air. But now follow it to where the evidence actually leads, because the gap between what seeding can do and what happened on July 16th is enormous. Cloud seeding, even by the most optimistic assessments, nudges rainfall at the margins. It can perhaps enhance precipitation from a cloud that was already going to rain, by some modest percentage, under favourable conditions. What it cannot do, what nothing in the technology comes close to being able to do, is manufacture a multi-county deluge that drops 6 to 15 inches of rain across a huge stretch of terrain. The amount of energy and moisture in a regional flood-producing storm complex is staggering, on a scale that dwarfs anything a few aircraft releasing trace materials could add or subtract. Seeding is a thumb on the scale. The July 16th event was the entire weight of the Gulf of Mexico being lifted over an escarpment. You cannot seed a flood like that into existence, and you cannot seed one away. There is a second version of the theory that is subtler and, I think, more understandable, and it comes directly from everything we have discussed. It is the sense that these storms are being steered on purpose toward Texas, because how else do you explain the same region flooding again and again? If you had watched only the weather and not the ground, that recurrence would look like targeting. Something keeps hitting this exact place. Somebody must be aiming it. But we have spent this whole video answering that question, and the answer is not a hand on a wheel. It is the Balcones Escarpment. The storms concentrate here because the land concentrates them here, lifting the Gulf moisture and wringing it out over this exact corridor, and it has done that since long before any human technology existed to be blamed. The recurrence is real. The targeting is an illusion produced by the ground. Pattern is not intent. When you see the same place flood over and over, you are not seeing a plan, you are seeing geology. Then there is the theory that runs in the opposite direction, the one that says the whole thing is overblown, that the forecasters hype these events, that the rain always gets downgraded, that it is all just weather and the warnings are fear-mongering. And here the rebuttal is almost too easy. because it is written directly into the day itself. This was not a scary forecast that failed to materialize. Major flooding was already occurring on the Nueces below Uvalde. Between 3 and 15 inches of rain had already fallen in Medina County. A dangerous flood wave was already moving down the Guadalupe. The event was not a prediction waiting to be proven. It was a flood in progress, being measured in real time by rain gauges and river sensors, while people were being told to get to higher ground. You cannot call something overhyped while it is actively happening. The data was not projecting a disaster, it was recording one. There is a deeper reason these engineering theories take hold, and it is worth naming with sympathy rather than scorn. When something terrible keeps happening, the human mind reaches for agency, for a who, because a who can be blamed, stopped, or held accountable. A world where floods are steered by a hidden hand is, in a strange way, more comforting than a world where floods are produced by an indifferent machine of rock and air, because at least the first world has someone in charge. The truth is harder precisely because there is no one at the wheel. There is only geology, physics, and a slowly warming sky, none of which can be voted out, arrested, or exposed. The pull toward a conspiracy is really a pull away from that harder, lonelier truth. And I understand it. But understanding why a theory is emotionally appealing is not the same as finding it correct, and the evidence here is not close. So where does that leave the honest posture between the people who think the floods are engineered and the people who think they are exaggerated? Squarely in the middle and squarely in the science. The floods are not manufactured by anyone, and they are not overblown by anyone. They are the entirely real, entirely explicable product of a flood-prone landscape being fed stalled storms out of a warming, moisture-heavy sky. Every part of that is measurable. None of it requires a villain, and none of it can be waved away. The temptation at both extremes to find a culprit or to find a hoax is really the same temptation, the wish that this was somebody's fault or somebody's fiction, because either of those would be easier to live with than the truth, and the truth is that no one is steering this. It is a system running on physics, on a landscape that has always been dangerous, under a sky that is slowly changing. That is harder to accept than a conspiracy, because there is no one to stop and nothing to expose. There is only a machine, and the question of how well we understand it. And understanding it means keeping it in proportion, which is why it is worth stepping back from Texas for a moment and looking at everything else the planet was doing on July 16th. Because while this one corner of the map was consumed by water, the rest of the Earth's usual sources of drama were on this particular day remarkably quiet. And that contrast, the calm everywhere else against the chaos here, says something about where the real danger was, and it is not where a lot of people were looking. Part 11. The calm above the chaos. On a lot of the days we spend together on this channel, the sky is where the trouble is. A sunspot the size of several Earths turning to face us, a coronal mass ejection racing outward, a solar storm threatening the power grid. But on July 16th, if you turned your attention upward and outward, away from the flooding and toward space, you found something almost eerie given what was happening on the ground. Peace. The sun, for once, was behaving itself, and the contrast is worth sitting with, because it points a spotlight at exactly where the danger actually lived that day. Consider the space weather picture. The standard scales that measure geomagnetic storms, solar radiation storms, and radio blackouts were all reading at their baseline, the quietest possible level, essentially 0 across the board. The disturbance in Earth's magnetic field is tracked by an index called the KP index, which runs from 0 to 9 and climbs as storms intensify, and its latest reading was sitting at 2, with a peak over the previous 24 hours of only 3, comfortably below the level 5 that marks even the weakest geomagnetic storm. The 3-day outlook expected it to stay capped around 3. The solar wind was moving at about 443 kilometers per second, a touch elevated, with the interplanetary magnetic field weak and only slightly tilted in the direction that lets the sun's energy leak into our magnetic field, not strongly or steadily enough to matter. And crucially, there were no Earth-directed coronal mass ejections in the pipeline, no great cloud of solar plasma aimed at us, nothing incoming to worry the people who watch the space environment for a living. The sun had fired a long-duration flare, peaking at around the C8 or C9 level on the flare scale. from a newly numbered active region rotating into view near the edge of its disk. But that region's odds of producing anything major were tiny, on the order of a few percent for a moderate flare and 1% for a large one, and none of it was pointed at Earth. Even the aurora forecast was muted, with the power feeding the northern lights sitting around 20 gigawatts, quiet enough that there was no meaningful chance of a mid-latitude display. Above the atmosphere it was quiet. Look a little closer to home, at the solid Earth, and the story was similar, ordinary rather than alarming. There were moderate earthquakes around the world that day, as there always are, the largest a magnitude 5.9 about 42 kilometres northwest of Te Anau in New Zealand, but it struck some 76 kilometres down, deep enough that the shaking spread out and softened before it reached the surface, and it drew only a green alert, the lowest level for expected impact. There was a shallower magnitude 5.2 southeast of McCarthy, Alaska, and a magnitude 5.5 out in the volcano islands of the Japan region, but across a full week the global count of earthquakes at magnitude 4.5 or greater was around 108, which is close to the ordinary planetary rhythm. None of them carried a tsunami warning. None of them was the kind of event that reshapes a day. The planet's tectonic background hum was running at its normal volume. Even the great western wildfires, which have been a running story all summer, were in their expected state. Enormous but being fought, and in most cases, increasingly contained. The largest, the Babylon fire in Utah, had grown past 107,000 acres, but was around 57% contained. Colorado's Aspen Acres fire stood near 99,000 acres, at roughly a third contained, and Utah's Cottonwood fire, though nearly as large, was about 80% contained, meaning crews had a firm grip on most of its perimeter. These are serious, sprawling fires, and we have devoted whole videos to what they represent. But on July 16th, they were not the crisis. They were the slow-burning background against which a much faster disaster was unfolding in Texas. It is worth pausing on why that ranking is so counterintuitive, because it reveals something about how we misjudge risk. A solar storm capable of damaging the power grid is genuinely one of the great hazards of our technological age, and an earthquake or a volcanic eruption can kill on a massive scale. Those are real, and we are right to watch them. But their defining feature is rarity. The truly grid-wrecking solar storm might come once in a generation or once in a century. The great earthquake strikes a given fault on a timescale of centuries. Flooding, by contrast, is not rare. It is the most frequent and, across the years, one of the deadliest natural hazards in the United States, and it does its killing not in single spectacular blows, but in a steady, grinding accumulation of ordinary bad afternoons. We fear the rare catastrophe and underrate the common one, and July 16th was a perfect illustration of the mismatch. The exotic threats were all quiet. The mundane one was killing. Line all of that up and the point becomes unmistakable. On a day when the sun was calm, the ground was steady and the fires were holding, the single most dangerous thing happening anywhere in the country was water falling on Texas. Not a solar storm, not an earthquake, not even the wildfires that had dominated so many recent headlines. Just rain, on the wrong landscape, in the wrong pattern, under a heavier sky. And that ought to recalibrate something in how we rank threats, because the truly lethal hazard that day was the most ordinary-sounding one imaginable. Rain. The thing that waters lawns and fills reservoirs and breaks droughts. In Flash Flood Alley, on the right afternoon, plain rain outranks a solar storm as a killer. There is a lesson in that contrast that goes beyond this one day. We're drawn, understandably, to the exotic dangers, the ones from space and from deep in the earth, because they feel cinematic and rare and beyond our control. And those dangers are real, and we cover them here because they matter. But the hazard that actually reaches out and takes lives year after year in this country is very often the mundane one. Moving water. It does not require a once-in-a-century solar event or a great earthquake. It requires a stalled storm, a flood-prone valley, and a person at a low crossing who did not know the wave was already coming. The drama of the sky can distract from the danger at the creek. On July 16th, the sky was quiet, and the creek was the thing to fear. And that reframes the whole video, because it means the story of the Texas floods is not really a story about a spectacular event at all. It is a story about a chronic condition, a place that will keep producing this exact danger under this exact combination of geology and pattern and warming sky, on days when nothing else in the heavens is happening to distract us. The threat is not that some rare catastrophe from above will strike. The threat is that this ordinary terrestrial water-driven machine will keep running, quietly, reliably, and that we will keep being surprised by it because it does not announce itself with the grandeur of a solar storm. Which is exactly why the most important thing about July 16th is not that it happened, but that it was not the first time and will not be the last. To really understand what we are looking at, we have to connect this day to the days around it, because this flood did not arrive out of nowhere. It was, in a sense, already part of a story we had been telling, appearing first at the edges before it moved to the centre, and tracing how it got from the edge of the map to the middle of it reveals the thing that should concern us most, which is not any single flood, but how easily and how often this corridor gets loaded up all over again. Part 12. How the edge became the centre. 2 days before this flood took over the map, it was already on our radar, but it was not the headline. It was a footnote to a bigger story. In the video from 2 days ago, the one about the atmosphere doing something forecasters rarely see, the main event was a rare severe weather and tornado outbreak pushing into the far north, into northern New England and up toward Canada, an unusual and dramatic display of a stuck weather pattern flinging violence to the edges of the country. And on the opposite edge of that same stuck pattern, way down south, we noted that the Texas Hill Country and the Big Bend were already flooding, already taking heavy rain, already under the same stalled setup as the wet counterpart to the northern storms. It was the same dome, producing opposite disasters at its opposite edges. Texas was one of those edges, and at the time, it was the smaller half of the story. Now look at what happened in the days since. The northern outbreak came and went as severe weather events do, a sharp burst that passed. But the Texas flooding did not pass. It deepened. It did not stay a footnote at the wet edge of someone else's dome. It moved to the centre of the entire national weather picture until it was the single largest concentration of warnings in the country and the most dangerous thing happening anywhere in America. The edge became the centre, the footnote became the headline, and it did that not because some new and unexpected force arrived, but simply because the same stalled pattern kept feeding the same Gulf moisture into the same flood-prone corridor day after day, until the water in Texas overwhelmed everything else on the map. And this is not the first time this summer that a flood in this exact corridor has surfaced in our coverage as the wet edge of a larger pattern. The Hill Country and Big Bend were flooding 2 days before July 16th. They'd shown up in the flood discussions before that, as the stalled pattern kept finding its way back to the same ground. This corridor is like a low spot in the room where the water keeps pooling. Whatever the larger pattern is doing whenever its wet side swings toward Texas, this is where the trouble collects, because this is where the geology gathers it. So across a single stretch of weeks, the same rivers kept appearing in the forecasts, sometimes as a footnote, sometimes as the headline, but always present, always primed, always one stalled pattern away from another flood. That progression is the thing I most want you to hold on to, because it is the real warning inside this whole story. The Hill Country does not need a special once-in-a-generation event to flood catastrophically. It floods whenever the ordinary machinery lines up, and the ordinary machinery lines up often. A stuck pattern that most of the country experienced as heat, or as a northern storm outbreak, or as just another humid week, expressed itself over this one corridor as a deadly escalating flood, simply because this corridor is where the geology turns rain into flood waves. The same weather that was a nuisance somewhere else was a life-threatening emergency here. That is what it means to live on top of a flood machine. You do not need bad luck. You just need the pattern to point your way for long enough, and eventually in any given summer, it will. And this is where the drought and flood whiplash we discussed earlier comes all the way back around, because it is the same underlying restlessness driving all of it. A pattern gets stuck. When it sticks, it bakes one region and drowns another and throws storms at a third, and it holds each of those conditions in place long enough to turn them extreme. The stuck pattern is the common engine behind the heat we covered, the drought we covered, the northern outbreak we covered, and this flood. They are not separate weather stories that happen to be clustered in one summer. They are the same overloaded, stalled atmosphere wearing different masks over different parts of the country. The flood in Texas is what that atmosphere looks like when its wet edge parks over Flash Flood Alley and will not move. Which means that the honest way to think about July 16th is not as a discrete disaster with a beginning and an end, but as one visible surfacing of a condition that is more or less always present and always waiting. The escarpment is always there, the Gulf is always warm in summer, the atmosphere is increasingly prone to getting stuck and increasingly loaded with moisture when it does. So the ingredients for a hill country flood are, in some form, nearly always on the table. What varies is the timing of the last ingredient, the stalled pattern pointing the storms this way. And when that final piece falls into place, the flood is not a surprise. It is the machine doing the only thing it knows how to do. And there is a documented, uncomfortable pattern in how communities respond to this kind of recurring hazard, one that psychologists and emergency managers have long recognized. When a place floods and then does not flood for a while, memory fades. New residents arrive who never saw the last big one. Development creeps back into the floodplain. The warnings start to feel routine, even overblown, precisely because most of the time the water stays in its banks. And then, the machine lines up again, and the flood that comes finds a population less prepared than the one before it. Because the very rarity of the worst events lulls people into treating them as impossible, rather than merely infrequent. In a place like Flash Flood Alley, where the catastrophic floods are separated by enough years for memory to dim but guaranteed by geology to return, that fading vigilance is itself a hazard, layered on top of the physical one. That is why the people who study this region do not really ask whether it will flood again. They ask when, and how bad, and whether the warnings will reach people in time, because the recurrence is not in doubt. Everything we have laid out guarantees it. A permanent flood-making landscape plus a summer atmosphere primed to stall and loaded with more moisture each year does not produce occasional unlucky floods. It produces a standing appointment with disaster that the region keeps, over and over, on a schedule set by the sky. And once you see it that way, the individual flood, terrible as it is, becomes almost the smaller part of the story. The larger part, the part the title has been pointing at all along, is what it means to live permanently on top of a machine like this, in an era that is quietly making the machine more dangerous. That is the answer that is worse than the flooding, and it is time to state it plainly. Part 13. The answer. Worse than the flooding. So let me finally say the whole thing in one breath, now that every piece is on the table. The flooding you saw on July 16th, the dangerous flood wave on the Guadalupe, the major flooding on the Nueces, the 3 to 15 inches in Medina County, the 55 Texas alerts, all of it is not the story. It is the symptom. The story, the answer that is genuinely worse than the flooding, is that this stretch of Texas sits permanently on top of the most efficient flood-producing machine in North America, that the machine runs on a landscape that will never change, that it is fed by a summer atmosphere increasingly prone to stalling in place, and that the sky pouring into it is being loaded with more water year by year, according to a law of physics that does not negotiate. The flood ends, the machine does not, and the machine is being upgraded against everyone's wishes by a warming world. That is worse than the flooding, because a flood is survivable, avoidable, recoverable. You can warn people, move them, rebuild, and wait for the water to drop. A permanent worsening condition is a different kind of problem. You cannot evacuate from a landscape you have chosen to live in and love. You cannot rebuild your way out of geology. And you cannot, on any timescale that helps the people living there now, reverse the warming that is raising the ceiling on the worst storms. The individual flood is a crisis you respond to. The condition underneath it is a reality you have to live inside, and it is quietly getting harder to live inside, 1 degree and 1/7% at a time. Sit with the human arithmetic of that, because it is the sharpest edge of the whole thing. This corridor is not emptying out. It is one of the fastest growing regions in the country, filling with new homes and new roads and new families drawn to the very rivers that flood. So on one side of the ledger, you have a flood machine being handed a heavier sky and a more stall-prone atmosphere, making the worst-case events more dangerous. And on the other side, you have more and more people moving into the exact valleys where those events play out. The hazard is intensifying and the exposure is increasing, at the same time, in the same place. Those two lines are moving toward each other, and where they cross is measured in human lives. That is not a forecast for July 16th. It is the trajectory of the region, and it does not depend on any single storm. And here is the part of the arithmetic that should focus everyone's attention, because it is where the two trends collide in a way you can almost watch happen. The hazard side of the ledger is rising slowly, driven by that 7% per degree loading of the sky, a change measured in decades. The exposure side is rising quickly, driven by a population boom measured in years, as one of the fastest growing regions in the country keeps pushing homes and roads and lives into the flood valleys. Slow line and fast line both climbing, and they do not need to climb far to meet, because they are already close. The valleys are already inhabited. The sky is already heavier than it was. Every summer that passes moves both lines up a notch, and the space between a near miss and a catastrophe narrows. That is not a prophecy about any single date. It is a description of a squeeze that is already underway, and that tightens a little with every year that both trends continue. None of this means despair, and I want to be clear about that because understanding a machine is the first step towards surviving it. The people who live in Flash Flood Alley are not helpless, and neither are the systems built to protect them. Warnings, when they arrive in time, save lives. The simple discipline of never driving into water over a road, of respecting a flood warning even under a clear sky, of knowing that a hill country river can rise in minutes, is the difference between a scare and a tragedy for a great many people. And the tools for that warning have gotten genuinely better. The Doppler radar that spotted those torrential downpours near Snyder can estimate rainfall rates in real time and flag where the worst totals are stacking up. River gauges scattered through the watersheds report their stage automatically, so that a wave building in the upper reaches can be seen and its arrival downstream anticipated before it gets there. Warnings can be pushed directly to the phone in your pocket within moments of being issued. None of that changes the geology or cools the sky, but it shortens the gap between when the water starts rising and when a person in its path knows to move. And in a place where that gap is measured in minutes, every minute of warning is a life it might save. The machine is powerful, but it is no longer invisible. We can watch it run now, in real time, and the watching is the closest thing to a defense that this landscape allows. The machine is powerful, but it is not unpredictable in its nature, only in its exact timing. And knowing what you are living on top of, really knowing it, the escarpment, the flood waves, the stalled storms, the heavier sky, changes how you respond when the warnings come. Knowledge does not stop the water, but it can help you not be standing in front of it. Still, the honest final accounting is sobering, and this channel does not flinch from it. We have watched, across a single summer, a country lock into extremes at both ends, drought hollowing out most of the land while a slice of Texas drowned, heat setting records in one place and floods setting them in another, all driven by the same overloaded, stalling atmosphere. July 16th is one frame from that larger film. It is the frame where the water won, in the one place in America most built to let it win. And the reason it won is not mysterious, and not anyone's plot, and not a fluke. It is a machine, running on physics, on ground that has always been dangerous, under a sky that is changing. The flood was loud. The condition beneath it is quiet, and permanent, and slowly getting worse. That is the answer. It was never really about the rain. But there is one thing this story does not yet know how to end, and it is the part that will decide what July 16th ultimately means. Because a flood in progress is a flood with a future, and on this particular day the machine was not finished. The forecast was already looking past the hill country to what came next, and what came next carried a question that no one on July 16th could answer, a question about whether this flood was the peak or only the first act. Part 14. What the river hasn't finished saying. Even as the hill country was drowning, the forecast was already looking west. The Weather Prediction Center's outlook had the heaviest rain axis shifting on Friday toward the Big Bend and western Texas, and then, by Saturday morning, becoming confined primarily to the western part of the state. Read one way, that is good news for the hill country, a sign that the worst of the training storms would finally slide off the flood-prone corridor and give the swollen rivers a chance to fall. But read another way, it is just the machine moving to a new set of channels, carrying the same danger to a different stretch of ground. The rain was not stopping, it was relocating. And that raises the first of the questions the day left hanging, whether the shift west would simply open a second separate flood in a new set of watersheds, while the first one was still draining. That westward shift is worth taking seriously as its own threat rather than as relief, because the Big Bend and far west Texas have their own version of the same vulnerability. The terrain there is rugged and arid, the soil is thin and sun-baked, and dry desert ground can shed a sudden downpour almost as violently as saturated hill country limestone, sending walls of water down normally dry arroyos and canyons with terrifying speed. So the rain axis sliding west did not necessarily mean the danger was easing. It could just as easily mean the flood machine was being handed a new set of channels to run through, in a region with fewer people to warn and longer distances between them. A shift on a forecast map is not the same as a threat ending. Often it is just the threat changing address, and the first flood was very much still draining, which is the second open question. When July 16th ended, that dangerous flood wave was still working its way down the Guadalupe, and major flooding was still occurring and still forecast on the Nueces below Uvalde. Rivers do not crest the moment the rain slows. The water that fell on the high country keeps arriving downstream for hours, sometimes for a day or more, so the peak on many of these rivers was still ahead of them as the sun went down. The warnings that ran late into the night were not leftover caution. They were the acknowledgement that the flood waves were still travelling, still building toward crests that had not yet happened, on rivers where the difference between one flood category and the next is measured in a few feet of stage. Whether those rivers would crest higher overnight than they already had, and whether any of them would be pushed from major flooding into something worse, was not knowable on the day itself. There is a grim logic to how river crests work that makes those overnight hours especially dangerous. Rain that falls in the afternoon does not reach the lower rivers until hours later, which means the peak on the downstream gauges often arrives in the dark, when people are asleep, when a rising river is hardest to see and a warning is easiest to miss. The flood wave does not keep business hours. It arrives when the water gets there, and on a day when heavy rain fell through the afternoon across the upper watersheds, the worst of it on the lower rivers was scheduled by the simple travel time of water downhill to hit overnight. That is a big part of why those warnings ran so late, and why the danger did not end when the rain did. Then there is the third thread, the one furthest out and most uncertain, and it hangs over an already saturated Texas like a raised hand. The same data feed that tracked the flooding noted a low-confidence possibility of a weak tropical system trying to develop in the northeastern Gulf of Mexico around the coming Sunday or Monday. The forecasters were split on whether it would even form, and if it did, on where it would go. But the mere possibility matters because of everything we have said about how this machine works. A tropical system is, above all, a delivery vehicle for tropical moisture, and tropical moisture is the fuel these floods run on. Push another surge of it toward a Texas whose ground is already saturated, whose rivers are already high, whose flood machine is already primed and running, and you do not need much imagination to see how a marginal system could become a serious problem out of all proportion to its size. Whether that Gulf reload materializes was, on July 16th, an open book. 3 questions then, all unanswered as the day closed. Would the shift west open a second flood? Would the rivers crest higher overnight? Would the Gulf reload the whole setup within days? And underneath all 3, the same machine we have spent this whole time taking apart, the escarpment and the flood waves, the stalled storms and the open Gulf pipeline, the heavier sky loading each storm with a little more water than the last. The specific answers to those 3 questions belong to the days that followed. But the machine that made them worth asking belongs to the place itself permanently, and it will still be there long after this particular flood is a line in a record book. That is the thing to carry out of all of this. Not the fear of one flood, but the understanding of a system, because the understanding is the only thing that travels forward and helps. The hill country will flood again. Everything we have laid out guarantees it. The only real variables are when the pattern points that way again, how much water the sky is holding when it does, and whether the people in the path know what they are living on top of well enough to get clear when the warning comes. The rock will not change, the Gulf will not cool, and the sky, for now, keeps getting a little heavier each year. So I will leave you standing where the people of the hill country stood, as the light failed on July 16th, with the water still rising downstream and the forecast already whispering about the Gulf. The rain over Texas would stop eventually this time. The rivers would fall. But the setup that produced all of it was still fully intact, and a possible tropical system was still turning over in the warm Gulf water to the southeast. And that leaves the one question that actually decides what this flood becomes in the end, If a landscape this dangerous is already saturated, already flooding, already at its limit, and the Gulf is preparing to hand it one more load of tropical moisture before the first flood has even finished draining, then how much is one more storm, arriving on ground that has nothing left to give, really going to take?